Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Friday, April 10th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The weather in Riverside is shaping up to be quite pleasant today, with a high of 77.8 degrees and a low of 55.8. It is a lovely day to step outside if you have the chance. In today's episode, we are diving into the legal trouble involving the Pentagon and exploring why a federal judge found them in contempt regarding their handling of journalist access. We will also examine the key details surrounding the return of the Artemis II mission crew to Earth. Beyond these headlines, we have a collection of other important updates from around the world to keep you informed. All this and more coming up on Alex's News. Stay tuned. We start this morning with a major legal showdown over press freedom at the Pentagon. A federal judge has now ruled twice that the Defense Department is violating the First Amendment by locking mainstream journalists out of the building. Ethan covers national security and government accountability for us. Ethan, bring us up to speed on what happened yesterday.
So just yesterday, April 9th, U.S. District Judge Paul Friedman found the Pentagon in contempt of his own earlier court order. According to the Associated Press and PBS NewsHour, the judge said the Defense Department tried to, quote, evade, end quote, an injunction he'd issued back on March 20th. That original ruling declared the administration's restrictive credentialing policy unconstitutional. But instead of restoring access, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's team rolled out what they called a new interim policy. Judge Friedman saw right through it, calling it a, quote, blatant attempt to circumvent, end quote, the law.
So what exactly did the Pentagon change that the judge found so problematic?
Well, one of the biggest moves was shutting down the correspondence corridor. That's the dedicated workspace inside the Pentagon where reporters have operated for decades. The Philadelphia Inquirer reports the department tried to relocate the press corps to an external library and conference center annex, essentially walling them off from officials. On top of that, all reporters would need government escorts at all times. The judge pointed out that kind of arrangement prevents journalists from doing the basic work of, quote, bumping into, end quote, sources, which is how a lot of important stories actually start.
And the judge used some pretty strong language about what's really driving these restrictions, right?
He did. In a 20-page opinion, he called the Pentagon's actions, quote, viewpoint discrimination, a full stop, end quote. The New York Times and CBS News both reported on that specific phrase. He accused the administration of trying to weed out what he called, quote, disfavored journalists, end quote, and replace them with reporters, quote, willing to serve, end quote, the administration. That's a critical legal finding because under First Amendment law, viewpoint discrimination triggers the highest level of judicial review. The government has to prove its actions are narrowly tailored to a compelling interest, and the judge clearly doesn't think they've done that.
Did Judge Friedman address national security concerns at all?
He did, and quite forcefully. He's a Bill Clinton appointee, and he emphasized that national security is preserved, not endangered, by a free press. He pointed specifically to the ongoing military operations in Venezuela and Iran, saying the public's need for independent information is at its highest right now. One of his sharpest lines was that, quote, suppressing political speech is the mark of an autocracy, not a democracy, end quote. That's a remarkable statement from a sitting federal judge directed at the Pentagon.
Let's back up a bit. How did this whole fight begin?
It traces back to October of last year. Dozens of reporters from major outlets, including the Associated Press, The Washington Post, and CNN, staged a walkout. The Guardian and The Washington Post both detailed how the Pentagon had introduced a new 21-page credentialing document. It required journalists to promise not to, quote, solicit, end quote, or, quote, induce, end quote, the disclosure of sensitive or unauthorized information, even if that information wasn't classified. News organizations called it a gag order that essentially criminalized investigative journalism. When they refused to sign, the Pentagon treated that refusal as a permanent forfeiture of their access.
So who's actually covering the Pentagon right now if mainstream reporters are locked out?
That's one of the most striking parts of this whole situation. The resident press corps right now consists almost exclusively of conservative and far-right outlets. We're talking about One America News and the Gateway Pundit, organizations that agree to the administration's terms. By December of last year, the New York Times and its reporter Julian E. Barnes filed a lawsuit against Secretary Hegseth to challenge the policy. So the building that's supposed to be covered by a broad cross-section of the American press is now being covered by a very narrow slice of it.
Now, the Pentagon hasn't just accepted these rulings quietly. What's their justification?
They've leaned heavily on what they call unauthorized disclosures related to military operations. Pentagon spokesperson Sean Parnell has maintained the policy is a, quote, materially revised, end quote, effort to balance press access with the, quote, safe and secure operation, end quote, of the building. But the judge and several investigative reports have suggested these justifications are more pretext than substance. The two incidents the Pentagon keeps pointing to actually undercut their own argument when you look at the details.
One of those incidents is what people have been calling Signalgate, correct?
Right, and this one's almost hard to believe. The Pentagon cited a March 2025 leak where operational details about strikes in Yemen were shared on an unsecure Signal group chat. But here's what The Atlantic and The Guardian revealed. It wasn't a press leak at all. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz accidentally added The Atlantic's editor-in-chief Jeffrey Goldberg to the private chat. Goldberg actually behaved responsibly and voluntarily withheld the information until the operation was already underway. And then a December 2025 Inspector General report faulted Secretary Hegseth himself for using unapproved personal messaging apps for sensitive communication. So the very leak they blamed on the press was actually their own internal mistake.
And what about the Venezuela operation? The Pentagon claimed leaks there endangered troops too.
That was Operation Absolute Resolve, the January 2026 capture of Nicolas Maduro. The Pentagon claimed press leaks put lives at risk. But Semaphore reported that the New York Times and the Washington Post actually coordinated with the government beforehand. They voluntarily delayed their reporting to protect operational security. So the two biggest examples the Pentagon has used to justify restricting press access both fall apart under scrutiny. In one case, it was the government's own error, and in the other, the press did exactly what the government asked.
So what happens now? Is there a hard deadline the Pentagon is facing?
Judge Friedman set a strict deadline of April 16th, which is 6 days from today. The Pentagon has to fully restore the access levels that existed before October 2025. They have to reopen the correspondence corridor. They have to stop enforcing rules that prohibit reporters from soliciting information. And a senior official has to file a sworn declaration under penalty of perjury detailing exactly how they've complied. If they don't, the judge could impose civil or criminal contempt, daily monetary fines, or even appoint a special master to oversee the Pentagon's press office.
And I understand the administration is already pushing back on all of this?
They are. CNN and the Associated Press report that the Department of Justice announced today, April 10th, its intent to appeal to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. But here's the critical point. As of right now, no emergency stay has been granted. That means the April 16th deadline is still legally binding while the appeal plays out. So the Pentagon is in a real bind. They either comply in 6 days or risk serious legal consequences.
Is there legal precedent that helps us understand where this might be headed?
There is, and it's nuanced. The Supreme Court held in Houchins v. KQED back in 1978 that the press doesn't have a greater right of access to government facilities than the general public. But Judge Friedman's ruling rests on a different principle. Once the government voluntarily creates a press facility, like the correspondence corridor, it can't then manage it through discriminatory or arbitrary means. That distinction is going to be central as this case moves to the D.C. Circuit. Legal scholars are calling it a landmark test of whether the executive branch can use security as a tool to curate a favorable press corps.
And this isn't happening in isolation, is it? There's a broader pattern here.
Not at all. According to NPR and the Philadelphia Inquirer, the administration has simultaneously sued major publications like the Wall Street Journal. They've cut funding for public broadcasting. They've selectively prioritized questions from friendly outlets during briefings. So this Pentagon case is really the sharpest edge of a much wider effort to reshape the relationship between the government and the press. What makes this particular fight so significant is that it's happening during active military operations when accountability matters most.
Ethan, thank you for walking us through all of that. We'll certainly be watching that April 16th deadline closely. Stay with us, we've got one more story ahead. We turn now to the other enormous story we're following this Friday morning. 4 NASA astronauts are in the final hours of humanity's first crewed trip to the moon in more than 50 years. The Artemis II Orion capsule, named Integrity, is set to splash down in the Pacific Ocean this evening. Chloe has been tracking every step of this 10-day mission. Chloe, set the scene for us. What's happening aboard that spacecraft right now?
The crew started their final day in space around 11:35 this morning Eastern Time. Right now, they're preparing for one of the most intense parts of the entire mission. According to Scientific American and Euronews, they'll begin configuring the cabin for re-entry around 1:50 this afternoon. That means stowing loose equipment and locking everything down so the capsule can handle extreme forces. Then, just before 3 o'clock, there's a critical trajectory correction burn to aim Integrity into a very precise slice of the atmosphere.
Walk us through who's on board. This crew has made history in several ways.
It really has. NPR reports the mission is led by Commander Reed Wiseman, with pilot Victor Glover, mission specialist Christina Koch, and Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen. Glover is the first person of color to travel beyond low Earth orbit, and Koch is the first woman to do so. Hansen's milestone is remarkable too. He's the first non-American citizen ever to journey to the moon.
And this mission launched on April 1st, so they've been up there about 10 days now. How far have they actually traveled?
The numbers are staggering. NASA and Scientific American report the total trip covers roughly 695,081 miles. On April 6th, the crew reached a peak distance of 252,760 miles from Earth. That shattered the record set by Apollo 13 back in 1970. During the lunar flyby, they passed within about 4,070 miles of the moon's surface, capturing high-resolution images and geological observations that scientists say could reshape our understanding of the moon's origins.
So tonight's splashdown is the grand finale. What does the timeline look like for the rest of today?
NASA's official livestream kicks off at 6:30 this evening Eastern. According to Euronews and Scientific American, about an hour later at 7:25, the capsule jettisons its European service module, which holds the solar panels and thrusters. That module will burn up in the atmosphere on its own. Then at 7:53, the capsule hits what they call entry interface at 400,000 feet. And the planned splashdown off the coast of San Diego is 8:07 page M.
That re-entry sounds harrowing. Pilot Victor Glover actually called it riding a fireball, right?
He did, and it's an apt description. According to Euronews and NPR, the capsule will be traveling at 25,000 miles per hour, that's Mach 32, generating temperatures around 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The whole plunge through the atmosphere takes about 13 minutes. During that stretch, there's a 6-minute communications blackout, where superheated plasma surrounds the craft and cuts off all contact with mission control. It's one of those moments where everyone on the ground just has to wait and trust the engineering.
6 minutes of silence. That must be agonizing for the teams in Houston. What happens once communication is restored?
That's when the parachute sequence begins, and it's a carefully staged process. At 25,000 feet, 2 drogue chutes deploy first to start slowing things down. Then, at 6,000 feet, 3 massive main parachutes unfurl. They bring the capsule from near supersonic speed all the way down to roughly 17 to 20 miles per hour for a relatively gentle splashdown in the Pacific.
Now, there's been a lot of concern about the heat shield on this mission. Can you explain what went wrong before and how NASA addressed it?
This is probably the biggest engineering storyline of the whole flight. NPR and Scientific American report that after the uncrewed Artemis I mission, NASA found unexpected damage on the heat shield. Chunks of the avcoat material had cracked and broken off instead of wearing away smoothly, They call it char loss or spalling. An independent review team investigated and found the material wasn't permeable enough. Gases generated by the extreme heat got trapped beneath the charred surface, built up pressure, and essentially blew pieces off.
So how did engineers fix that problem for this crew?
They couldn't redesign the entire heat shield in time, so they changed the way the capsule flies through the atmosphere. NASA opted for what they call a lofted or steeper and faster re-entry profile. Instead of skipping along the upper atmosphere like Artemis I did, this approach keeps the capsule deeper in the atmosphere with continuous heating. That keeps the outer layer hot enough to stay permeable, letting trapped gases vent safely rather than building up and cracking the surface. It's a clever workaround, but it does come with trade-offs.
What kind of trade-offs are we talking about?
The big one is G-forces. Scientific American and Euronews note that the nominal descent will hit around 3.9 gigaseconds, which is significant but manageable. However, in certain contingency scenarios, the crew could experience 7 to 7.5 Gs. That's intense even for trained astronauts. The steeper path also shrinks what they call cross-range capability. The landing corridor narrows from 5,000 nautical miles to roughly 1,775, which gives NASA far less flexibility in choosing where to splash down.
Speaking of the splashdown zone, what's waiting for the crew in the Pacific?
The USS John P. Murtha, a Navy recovery ship, is already on station off San Diego. Euronews reports that Recovery Director Liliana Villarreal is overseeing the operation. Once the capsule hits the water, 5 orange airbags inflate to keep it upright. Then divers move in to assist the astronauts out through the hatch and onto an inflatable raft they've nicknamed the front porch. From there, helicopters winch them up and ferry them to the ship.
After 10 days in space, the crew must face some physical challenges coming back to gravity. What are doctors watching for?
The main concern is something called orthostatic intolerance, where blood pressure drops sharply when you return to a gravitational environment. It can cause dizziness and even fainting. To combat that, the crew has been wearing specialized compression garments during the return leg of the trip. Once aboard the Murtha, they'll undergo thorough medical examinations to make sure everyone's readjusting safely.
There have also been some lighter moments on this mission. I heard the space toilet made headlines.
It did, and the results were mixed. The crew tested the first space toilet specifically designed for lunar missions, and the toilet itself apparently worked fine. But the urine dumping system failed, so they had to resort to manual urinals. Not exactly glamorous, but it's the kind of real-world data engineers need before sending people to live on the moon. They also brought along a small, plush zero-G indicator named RISE, a nod to the famous Earthrise photo from Apollo 8.
And there was a really emotional moment during the lunar flyby involving Commander Wiseman. What happened there?
This one hit a lot of people hard. During the flyby, the crew asked to name 2 craters they observed. They chose Integrity for one, after their spacecraft. The other, they named Carol, in honor of Commander Reed Wiseman's late wife. It was a deeply personal tribute during what's already a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Those kinds of moments remind you there are real human beings behind the helmets and flight suits.
Looking past tonight, what does this mission mean for NASA's bigger plans at the moon?
Everything about tonight feeds directly into Artemis II, which NPR and Scientific American report is currently targeted for 2027. That mission aims to put humans back on the lunar surface for the first time since 1972. Once the Orion capsule is recovered and shipped back to Kennedy Space Center in Florida, engineers will do a full, stripped-down analysis of the heat shield and plumbing. The NASA Office of Inspector General has labeled the heat shield issues a significant risk, so a clean result tonight would go a long way toward proving the spacecraft is safe for an actual landing mission.
So tonight's splashdown is really a proving ground for everything that comes next.
Exactly. If this lofted reentry works as planned, it validates the fix for the heat shield problem and clears a major hurdle. It also gives NASA confidence in the life support systems, the parachute sequence, and the recovery process with a live crew. Every data point from tonight gets folded into the Artemis III design. In a very real sense, returning to the lunar surface starts with what happens in the Pacific this evening.
Chloe, thank you for breaking all of that down for us. We'll be watching that NASA live stream starting at 6:30 tonight Eastern and covering the splashdown live right here. Here are some other headlines. Diplomatic delegations from the United States and Iran are Pakistaning their bags for negotiations in Islamabad, scheduled to begin tomorrow, April 10, 2026. This follows a fragile 2-week ceasefire, brokered by Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif. President Donald Trump announced the truce on Truth Social just hours before a military escalation deadline, describing Iran's 10-point counterproposal, including demands for sanctions relief and the withdrawal of American combat forces, as a workable basis for talks. However, the push to end the 40-day war remains tenuous. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi warned that continued Israeli strikes in Lebanon could collapse the agreement, while the White House maintains that Lebanon remains outside the scope of the truce. This diplomatic push is a vital chance to stabilize energy markets, which saw oil prices drop 13%. Vice President J.D. Vance leads the American team, racing against a tight 14-day window to reconcile conflicting demands over the Strait of Hormuz. The outcome will decide if the United States accepts Iranian sovereignty over the waterway, a move that could redefine the region for decades and finally offer some straightforward progress. In a move that is seeding a new path for peace, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu authorized his cabinet to initiate direct negotiations with Lebanon to discuss the disarmament of Hezbollah and normalization. These talks are expected to begin next week at the State Department in Washington, with Ambassador Michel Issa mediating between Israeli Ambassador Yechiel Leiter and Lebanese officials. While this could lead to the first formal peaceful relation since 1948, Netanyahu is not letting his guard down, clarifying that the military will continue striking Hezbollah with force until security is restored, as these negotiations remain very much under fire. Domestically, the Bureau of Labor Statistics is releasing the March Consumer Price Index report at 8:30 a.m. Eastern today, and it is a crude awakening for the economy. Economists forecast a sharp surge in annualized inflation to 3.4%, up from 2.4% in February. This spike is driven by the conflict in Iran, which pushed oil prices above $100 per barrel and caused the fastest rise in gasoline costs in 30 years. St. Louis Fed President Alberto Musalem warned this energy shock may force the central bank to pause its planned 2026 interest rate cuts. Globally, Japan's producer inflation accelerated to 2.6%, and the IMF projects American inflation will remain above target. It is certainly an interesting time for investors in this volatile AI-driven market. In more pipeline-shattering news, Kuwait's foreign ministry formally accused Iran and its proxies of launching drone strikes against vital facilities. President Trump cast doubt on the ceasefire's effectiveness, posting that Iran is doing a very poor job of reopening the Strait of Hormuz. While the Revolutionary Guard denied the claims, Saudi Arabia acknowledged damage to its east-west oil pipeline. With over 3,000 lives already lost, negotiators are hoping to pipe down the rhetoric before the Islamabad summit. Finally, a historic religious rift has reached a boiling point as Pope Leo XIV, the first American-born pontiff, directly condemned President Trump's recent military threats. The Chicago-born Pope described the president's warning that an entire civilization will die tonight as a moral crisis, and truly unacceptable. While Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth claimed the military posture carries heavenly endorsement, the Pope is now urging Americans to contact their representatives to advocate for peace, potentially undermining domestic support for the war. It seems the two leaders are at a crossroads, with the Vatican leveraging its global influence to challenge the administration's transactional approach. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with Claude Opus 4.6, Gemini Pro 3.1, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.